So I feel that one of the reasons why people become disillusioned and tend to become inactive as far as getting their next auditing or training is concerned is due to an ARC break of such magnitude that they feel that their only course is to withdraw, try to hope that it didn't happen, but if it did, in some way to try and show that they were right for doing what they did, even though they now think they shouldn't have done it. Whether it was joining the Sea Org or whether it was buying auditing or whatever it was. And interestingly enough, another person that I know who went through that particular phase started to explain to me that what he was going to do was he was going to disconnect from the subject and from all the people that were pushing auditing because he needed to go destimulate. And he told me that he was doing that because he didn't think that the tech worked anymore. And what I thought was interesting about it was that he was using part of the tech to try to handle the dilemma that he was faced with at the time. The answer really is not to withdraw or try to rationalize or change the fact that one has been hurt. The answer is actually to become more involved. And that's the ultimate solution, to become more involved with it and to understand the factors that could have brought this about. One of the biggest problems that I think we have in the future, we have it now, but I think it's going to become more pronounced in the future, is that of disseminating. And I've tried recently, I don't know how many of you have recently, but I'm sure that opportunities come up from time to time, or in the course of a conversation you mention the word Scientology to somebody who is not involved in it. And there definitely are very heavy obstacles to disseminating. And it's because, as we know, the reputation of the subject has been heavily affected by very untoward incidents that have occurred. Now, for some years I was told when I was a staff member that that was all black PR, and that people called enemies had generated these false reports and so on, and that the obvious handling was to point out to somebody who'd heard of such an instance, to point out to them that it was simply false and didn't happen and so on. One of the things that I found out very rapidly after I left the Sea Org and rubbed shoulders with people who had had no previous contact with Scientology. Such people have gone by various names in the past, but somebody recently suggested they could be called uncooked rather than raw. But in contact with people who had had no previous contact with Scientology, and I'd hear some of these stories from them, and found out that they were not simply rumors or stories. Most of these people knew somebody. It had either happened to them or they knew somebody personally who had experienced such a thing. So it wasn't any good to say that the bad reputation that had grown simply came from false propaganda. It hadn't. It came from actual untoward incidents done by people or by the organization, which are inconsistent with the basic philosophy of Scientology. Now, there are many reasons why all that could have come about. I'm going to express some ideas today which I haven't expressed before, and maybe other people have, but I think it's worth looking at some new approaches to it, because at least we can say the situation's still going on. One possibility is that maybe you and I and others, maybe we came into Scientology for the wrong reason. Such a possibility would be maybe we came into it hoping that somebody else would give us all the answers, would make the decisions for us, and that we wouldn't have to evaluate data or find out what really was the truth. If that were the case, and I would have to admit that to some degree when I first started reading the books I thought, I hope this is all true. I didn't personally verify it all. And I think that might be something that's common to other people too. But when one sets aside one's own ability to determine the truth of data, one has given away responsibility. And it wouldn't matter if the data were true or not. It's still an act of irresponsibility. It's an act of assigning cause and responsibility for one's decisions, for one's purposes, for one's goals. It's assigning them to another person. And it's assigning how one is going to conduct oneself in life to another person. So that's a possibility. Of course, it's also possible that one came into Scientology with the correct reason on that subject. One came in to look for the truth and to evaluate each datum for oneself to decide whether it was true or not. And then one may have been faced with a dilemma. For example, one may have done this consistently through one's studies of the subject, and then come to a point when somebody told you what the price for your next intensive was. And you thought, well, wait a minute, this doesn't make sense. Now, and this person might reject that particular datum as not being logical and not being true, and all the reasons given for it not being true. But at such a point, what if one were told, well, that's the way it is, you either go along with it or you miss out? What choice do you have at that point? If there was no alternative, one could say that there was no choice but to go along with it. Unfortunately, when one sacrifices one's integrity in order to get a service which would raise one's integrity, you have a paradox. It becomes self-defeating. And actually, the fact that anything like that exists is actually sufficient to virtually prevent the tech from working at all. There's a classic example which I've talked about before, which is a very exaggerated version of that, which was a particular day when there was a large commune going on of a number of ex-senior executives of the Church of Scientology. And at one particular point during that, these people, myself included, were all informed that they had a certain choice, which was that they either toe the line, I guess is the way to put it briefly, or they would lose their eternity, or they would lose their bridge for all eternity. Faced with such a choice, which magnifies it much more than the simple matter of higher prices or harsh ethics, faced with a choice like that, instead of it becoming more overwhelming, it actually becomes more obvious as to what decision one should make. Obviously, if one's faced with the choice of having to agree with things which one doesn't agree with, or pay lip service to agreeing with things that one doesn't agree with, in order to not lose one's eternity, it's obvious that either way one would have lost one's eternity, and that the only way to maintain one's integrity would be simply to say no. That makes it a lot more obvious. What's actually harder to handle are the little instances, the times when the price was just a little too high,